The Olympic Forest, a sprawling expanse of trees and rugged wilderness, was once thought to be a peaceful escape for those who sought solitude. Nestled on the edge of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state, it was the perfect getaway for those who loved the outdoors. But in 2006, the forest became the backdrop to one of the most perplexing disappearances in modern history. A family of four, father, mother, and two children, vanished without a trace while on a hiking trip in the forest. For years, there were no answers, no body, no evidence, no explanation, just silence. Then, 7 years later, an extraordinary discovery would turn everything upside down. In a remote cave, far off the beaten path, a car was found sealed in the dark, its windows thick with dirt and overgrowth. The family's car, exactly where it shouldn't have been, and inside, the mystery deepened. The family had set out for a weekend hike, their plan simple: spend a couple of days in the Olympic Forest, explore the trails, and return home refreshed. But by Sunday evening, no one had heard from them. Calls went unanswered, and when the local authorities were contacted, the search began. It didn't take long for the first search teams to go out. The National Park Service, along with state authorities, coordinated efforts to comb through the thick forests, calling in helicopters and search dogs to cover the sprawling wilderness. Days turned into weeks, but no sign of the family was found. Their trail was non-existent. No footprints, no clues. It was as though they had vanished into thin air. In the absence of concrete evidence, theories began to surface. Some speculated that they had fallen victim to the wild terrain, succumbing to an accident, or perhaps a sudden health issue. Others speculated about wild animal attacks: cougars, wolves, bears. But despite exhaustive efforts, no remains, no signs of struggle, no traces of wildlife involvement could be found. The search slowed. Then, the case was closed. For years, the mystery remained unsolved, becoming another entry in the long list of strange disappearances in the Pacific Northwest. The forest, with its dense, tangled undergrowth, continued to watch over its secrets. Time passed, and the case was buried under layers of forgotten files and unspoken questions. But then, in 2013, the discovery in the cave changed everything. The car was found in a narrow, uncharted cave system, hidden beneath thick layers of moss and dirt. It was a miracle that it had been found at all, and an even greater miracle that it was intact. No signs of fire or flooding, just a car, buried in the earth for 7 years. The car was identified immediately. It was the same vehicle the family had been driving on their trip. There was no mistaking it. Inside, the seats were covered with dirt and leaves, but the family's belongings, piles of clothes, an old backpack, children's toys, were still there. The windows were clouded with grime, but a quick inspection revealed something truly disturbing. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine still intact, though covered in dust. The car hadn't been driven in years. The authorities quickly sealed off the area and began an official investigation. Forensic teams arrived on site, eager to find out what had happened to the family. The car was carefully examined, but there were no immediate signs of foul play. No blood, no obvious injuries, nothing that could explain why the car had been sealed away in such an isolated spot. Then, the most perplexing detail surfaced. On the dashboard of the car was a single, handwritten note. It read, "They're watching us." The note was scrutinized carefully by experts, but there was no indication of who had written it or when. It wasn't a child's handwriting, nor was it the father's. It was scrawled quickly, almost frantically, as if written in haste. The discovery made national headlines. Speculation surged. Was it a bizarre accident? Did the family become lost, trapped in the wilderness, only to find themselves stumbling upon this remote cave by sheer accident? Or was there something more to the story, something far darker, far more sinister? Was the family targeted? Had they stumbled upon something they shouldn't have? Theories flooded in, ranging from the mundane to the supernatural. Some pointed to an animal attack, suggesting that the family had been killed by wildlife and their car abandoned. Others spoke of the possibility of an isolated cult operating within the depths of the forest. Some even suggested that the family had been part of an experimental government project and their disappearance was part of a larger cover-up. Among the many theories, one stood out, one that would soon draw the attention of investigators: the possibility of a hidden, long-forgotten network of caves within the Olympic Forest. The forest was known for its isolated terrain, and there were rumors of old mining tunnels and abandoned hideouts that could have easily been overlooked by previous searches. What if the family had stumbled upon one of these caves, only to find themselves trapped, unable to escape? As the investigation continued, it became clear that there was more to the story than met the eye. Forensic teams began to analyze the family's car in more detail, hoping to uncover new clues. In the glove compartment, they found a half-burnt map of the forest, with several areas marked in red ink. One of these markings was near Soda Springs, an area that had been off-limits for years due to unstable terrain. But the real breakthrough came when the family's phone records were retrieved. For the first time, investigators found a clue that pointed to something truly bizarre: a series of unusual phone calls made from the family's phone in the hours before their disappearance. These calls weren't made to family members or friends. They were made to a number that had been disconnected years ago, a number that led to an abandoned warehouse in the nearby town of Forks. The warehouse was known to be linked to a company that had shut down over a decade ago, and its owners had no known connections to the family. The evidence was puzzling. Was this just a coincidence? Had someone been trying to reach the family before they disappeared, or had the family been trying to contact someone they didn't know? The phone record suggested that they had been on the verge of making a crucial discovery, but the circumstances surrounding their final hours remained unclear. As the mystery continued to unfold, one thing became abundantly clear: the family's disappearance was not an isolated incident. There were other people who had gone missing in the Olympic Forest over the years, cases that had been left unsolved, overlooked, and forgotten. Each one of them seemed to share a common thread, a deep connection to the forest, a connection that was both eerie and terrifying. But as the investigation moved forward, the questions remained unanswered. What had happened to the family? What had they discovered in the forest? And what was it that they had been running from, if anything at all? The final piece of the puzzle would come when an old photograph surfaced, one that had been taken long before the family ever set foot in the Olympic Forest. In the picture, a group of men and women stood in front of an old, decrepit building deep within the park's boundaries. In the foreground, a young man held up a sign that read, "Stay away from the forest. Some things are better left undiscovered." The photo, dated to the 1950s, was found among the belongings of a local historian who had died under mysterious circumstances in the early 2000s. And as the investigator turned the photo over, he found one final detail scrawled on the back: "The forest is not empty, it's waiting." What truly happened to the family in 2006 remains a mystery, but one thing is certain: the Olympic Forest is not just a place for hiking and camping. It is a place that holds secrets, dark and hidden beneath its towering trees and misty fog, and some secrets are better left undiscovered. The investigation into the disappearance of the family seemed to reach an impasse. After the discovery of the car in the cave, it was as if the park itself had closed its doors, swallowing the mystery whole. Authorities, unable to make sense of the situation, began to turn their focus away from the case, dismissing it as an unfortunate accident, the kind that could happen in such an isolated place. But the more the investigation lagged, the more troubling the unanswered questions became. For weeks, no new leads emerged. The family's personal belongings, their phones, and even the handwritten note left in the car provided little more than vague breadcrumbs, each one leading to more dead ends. In a final attempt to make sense of what happened, the FBI stepped in, taking over the investigation, though even they were careful to avoid calling the case anything more than a tragic missing person event. The media quickly lost interest, moving on to the next story, leaving the family's fate to fester in the dark corners of public consciousness. But then, in 2014, an unexpected breakthrough occurred, though it didn't come from the authorities. A local journalist named Claire Benton, who had been fascinated by the case ever since the discovery of the car, dug deeper into the family's past. What she uncovered sent shockwaves through her small newsroom and quickly became the talk of the town. Claire discovered that the family wasn't as ordinary as they had appeared. The father, Brian Matthews, was a scientist, a researcher with a history of working with obscure geological projects. He had published several papers on the Olympic Peninsula, specifically about the area's unusual seismic activity, the strange magnetic fields in the region, and even reports of unexplainable natural occurrences. Further investigation into Brian's past revealed something even more chilling. In the months before his disappearance, he had made several trips to a remote location in the forest, places that didn't appear on any official maps. The places he had visited were marked by symbols similar to those that had appeared on the map found in the car. But even more disturbing, the last email Brian had sent just days before their trip, was a cryptic message to a colleague. "I think I've found it. Whatever it is, it's waiting. I can feel it now, drawing me in. The forest is not empty. It's something else." This email was sent to a scientist at a university, someone whose work had once been closely linked with Brian's own. When Claire reached out to this colleague, he was reluctant to speak, but he confirmed the link between Brian's research and a series of strange phenomena in the forest. He spoke of seismic disturbances, of unexplained magnetic fluctuations, and of long-forgotten rituals tied to the indigenous people who once lived in the area. According to the colleague, Brian had grown obsessed with the idea that something was buried beneath the forest, something ancient, something connected to the land itself. As Claire dug deeper, she found more strange details about the Matthews family. Brian's wife, Jessica, was a history teacher with a deep interest in Native American cultures, particularly the lost tribes of the Olympic Peninsula. She had, in her personal journals, written about mysterious folk tales, ones that spoke of an ancient presence that had once been worshipped in the forest. According to these stories, the forest was not merely a place to visit. It was a place that consumed those who tried to uncover its secrets. It was a place that lured people in, drawing them closer with every step, only to swallow them whole. With these revelations, the case took on a new light. The Matthews family's disappearance wasn't just an accident. It wasn't simply the result of an unfortunate hike gone wrong. No, the more Claire uncovered, the more she realized that the forest had drawn them in, just as it had drawn in others before them. And what was more terrifying, what made the case even more bizarre, was the possibility that the family had been led there, not by choice, but by some unseen force. As Claire continued to investigate, she began to hear whispers from local residents, people who had lived on the edge of the park their entire lives. Many spoke of things they had seen in the forest, things they could never explain. Some told stories of disappearing hikers, of animals behaving strangely, of a deep, unnatural quiet that sometimes overtook the park, as if the very air had thickened. Others spoke of a certain area, a region near Soda Springs, where people had been known to vanish over the years. But there was one story that stood out above the rest, a story about a cave deep in the forest, one that no one ever talked about, a cave that had been sealed for years. One of the locals, an elderly man named Henry, had lived near the park for most of his life. When Claire spoke to him, he gave her a warning. "Don't go looking for answers out there. Some things are better left alone. The forest has a way of hiding things that don't belong in the light." Claire, intrigued by the mention of the cave, decided to visit the area herself. She armed herself with maps and old accounts from previous researchers. She hiked into the forest, determined to uncover whatever was hidden in the shadows. As she neared the area near Soda Springs, she could feel the air grow thick, heavy with something unexplainable. The forest felt too quiet, too still. It was a suffocating silence, like the forest itself was holding its breath. It wasn't long before she found the cave. Hidden away from view, nestled between rocks and overgrown brush, it was almost impossible to see unless you knew exactly where to look. As she stepped inside, the temperature dropped suddenly and the air grew dense, almost suffocating. The walls of the cave were lined with strange markings, symbols that matched those that had been found in Brian's research. And in the center of the cave, Claire found something that stopped her in her tracks, the remnants of a fire pit. The stone surrounding it was blackened, and there were traces of charred wood scattered around. But what made her blood run cold was the discovery that the fire pit was still warm, as if someone had been there recently. It was at that moment Claire realized the terrifying truth. The family hadn't just stumbled upon the forest. They hadn't disappeared into thin air. They had been drawn here, just as others had been before them. The cave, the fire pit, the symbols, it was all part of a larger, darker presence that had existed in the park long before anyone could have imagined. As Claire made her way out of the cave, her mind raced with the implications of what she had discovered. She had uncovered a hidden layer of the park's history, one that the authorities had long ignored. But she also knew something else. The family was not the first to disappear in the forest, and they wouldn't be the last. As the sun set over the Olympic forest, Claire felt the weight of her discoveries settle in her chest. The park, she realized, was not just a place of natural beauty. It was a place that hid dark secrets, secrets that had been buried for generations. And if she was to uncover the truth, she would have to confront whatever waited in the shadows. But as she walked back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to get too close, just as it had done to the Matthews family. The forest wasn't done with its secrets yet, and neither was Claire. As Claire Benton made her way back to the town of Forks, the weight of her discoveries pressed down on her. Each step a reminder that the Olympic forest was a place that held more than just natural beauty. It was a place steeped in secrets, some of which should have remained hidden. But her investigation had only just begun, and the more she uncovered, the deeper she was drawn into the web of mystery that had surrounded the Matthews family's disappearance. The discovery of the cave, with its strange symbols and remnants of a fire pit, was only the beginning. Claire couldn't ignore the unsettling sense of being watched that lingered long after she had left the forest. It wasn't just the eerie quiet of the wilderness that unsettled her. It was the feeling that there was something in the forest, something far older and more dangerous, something that had been waiting for years. Back in Forks, Claire found herself returning to the old journals she had collected from local residents. Among them was a journal written by a park ranger named Thomas Gray, who had worked in the Olympic forest in the late 1980s. His entries, while detailed, were unsettling. Gray wrote about strange occurrences he had witnessed during his time patrolling the forest, unexplained disappearances, eerie lights flickering in the distance, and odd, distorted sounds carried by the wind. But what caught Claire's attention the most were the final entries in Gray's journal, written just before he was transferred out of the park. "It's not just the people who vanish here," Gray had written. "It's the land itself. There are places in the forest where time doesn't work the same, places where the trees grow in ways that make no sense, and the air is thick with something that makes it hard to breathe. I've heard rumors, whispers about something older than the forest itself, something that preys on those who come too close. I don't know if I believe it, but I've seen things that I can't explain, things that make me wonder if I'm just as trapped as the others." Claire sat back in her chair, the weight of the words sinking in. She had heard similar stories before, but they were always dismissed as superstition, as the tall tales of people who had lived too long in isolation. But now, with the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place, she realized that there was more to these stories than she had first believed. The Matthews family had been drawn into something much darker than a simple wilderness accident. They had stumbled upon the very heart of the forest's secrets, a place that no one was meant to uncover. As she continued her research, Claire began to find more references to a series of bizarre disappearances stretching back decades. In the 1940s, a local logging crew had disappeared without a trace while working deep in the forest. In the 1960s, a group of campers had vanished from a popular trail, their campsite untouched, their belongings left behind. Each disappearance seemed to follow a similar pattern. No signs of struggle, no tracks leading away from the site, just an eerie absence that left behind more questions than answers. But it wasn't just the people who disappeared that were significant. The forest itself seemed to hold its own kind of malevolence, a presence that watched from the shadows, waiting for those who ventured too far. The more Claire researched, the more she began to see the pattern, the disappearances, the strange symbols, the references to the ancient presence that lived within the forest. It was as if the forest itself was alive, a living entity that consumed those who sought to uncover its secrets. One evening, as Claire was reviewing her notes, she received an unexpected phone call. It was from a man named Richard Ellis, an old friend of Brian Matthews, the father of the missing family. Richard had heard about her investigation and wanted to meet. He had information, he said, that could change everything. The meeting took place in a small, dimly lit diner on the outskirts of Forks. Richard was a man in his mid-50s, his face weathered by years of outdoor work. He had been a childhood friend of Brian Matthews, and the two had reconnected in recent years over their shared interest in the wilderness. But Richard's expression was grim, his eyes heavy with secrets he seemed unwilling to share. "I've been following what you're doing," Richard said, his voice low. "You're looking in places that people don't want you to look. There's more to this story than just the family disappearing, more than you'll ever find in the forest." Claire listened carefully, her pen poised over her notebook. Richard seemed reluctant to speak at first, but as the minutes passed, the floodgates opened. He spoke of Brian's increasing obsession with the Olympic forest, how he had become fixated on the idea that the land was hiding something that had been buried for centuries. Brian wasn't just hiking in the forest for fun, Richard said. He was tracking something. I don't know what it was, but he was convinced there was something buried in those woods, something tied to the history of the land. He had been going up to the same area over and over again, near Soda Springs. I think he was getting closer to something. I think he found it. Richard's words sent a shiver down Claire's spine. It wasn't just the Matthews family who had been involved in this mystery. It was Brian, too. He had known more than anyone had realized. He had been on the verge of uncovering something, but had he gotten too close? Had he uncovered something that he couldn't escape? Richard's voice dropped to a whisper, as though afraid of being overheard. There are stories that no one talks about. People say the forest has a history of drawing people in. And once you're in, it doesn't let you go. Claire's heart raced. She had heard rumors like this before, but hearing them from someone so close to Brian made them feel real. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't just a family who got lost in the wilderness. There was something much darker at play, something that had been hiding in the forest for decades, if not longer. Richard leaned forward, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. "You need to stop, Claire. The forest is dangerous. It's not just a place, it's a force. Whatever Brian found, whatever he was tracking, it's not something you can understand. I don't know what happened to them, but I know one thing. You don't want to know." But Claire couldn't stop now. She was too close. She had to know what had happened to the Matthews family. She had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The next day, she returned to the forest, determined to follow the clues that had been laid before her. But as she walked deeper into the wilderness, the feeling that something was watching her, something ancient and unseen, grew stronger. She wasn't just searching for answers anymore. She was searching for something far darker, a truth that would change everything. And as she moved further into the Olympic forest, Claire knew that she was no longer alone. Something was waiting for her, something that had been waiting for decades. Claire's heart pounded as she walked deeper into the forest. The air had grown dense, thick with the scent of moss and earth, a heavy, oppressive weight pressing down from the canopy above. Each step forward felt like a step into the unknown, and every instinct screamed for her to turn back. But she couldn't. The story, the unanswered questions, were too important. She had already uncovered too much to stop now. Her research had led her to an isolated section of the park, close to Soda Springs. She'd studied maps from the early 1900s, referencing old surveys, but nothing had prepared her for the eerie stillness of this place. It felt different from any other part of the forest she had walked through, like the air itself was charged, as if it could snap at any moment. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The information she had gathered, the conversations with Richard, the journals, it was all pointing here. There was something about this area, something connected to the Matthews family's disappearance. But what? What had they found? And why had they been drawn to it? The dense underbrush scratched at her legs as she navigated the trail, her flashlight cutting through the growing twilight. Despite the heavy atmosphere, Claire pushed forward, compelled by a gnawing need to understand. This place, whatever it was, had taken the Matthews family, and countless others before them. She had to know why. Her eyes scanned the surroundings as she moved deeper into the heart of the forest. The trees were gnarled, twisted in unnatural ways, their branches twisting like reaching fingers, clawing at the sky. A strange quiet had descended around her. There was no sound, no rustling of leaves, no birds or insects, just the unsettling feeling that something was watching, waiting. After nearly an hour of hiking, she stumbled upon a clearing, an unexpected open space where the ground seemed oddly level. The sight before her was both breathtaking and terrifying. There, in the middle of the clearing, was an old weathered stone circle, partially overgrown with moss and creeping ivy. The stones were large and jagged, arranged in a circular pattern that had clearly been deliberate, though time had worn them down. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she approached the circle, her flashlight illuminating the area. The ground inside the stone ring was bare, but as she moved closer, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Another symbol, etched into the stone at the center. It was the same symbol she had seen before, the one carved into the trees near the cave, the one connected to Brian Matthews' research. The markings were faint, almost worn away by the elements, but they were unmistakable. She crouched down, running her fingers over the jagged edges of the stone, tracing the familiar lines. It felt ancient, older than anything she had encountered in the forest so far, as if this place, this circle, had been here for centuries, untouched by time, yet hidden from those who would search for it. The symbol had a strange, hypnotic quality, as if it was meant to draw people in. Claire felt her mind cloud, a momentary dizziness overtaking her as she continued to trace the lines. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A glint of something metallic beneath the underbrush. Her heart skipped a beat as she scrambled toward it, brushing aside the thick layer of moss and dirt. She pulled something free from the earth, a small rusted key. It was a key, but it was unlike any Claire had ever seen before. It was old, its metal tarnished and covered in grime, but it had a strange, intricate design, unlike any standard key. It looked ceremonial, almost purposeful, as if it had been crafted for something far beyond its simple function. Claire stood there, the key in her hand, her mind racing. What was this doing here, buried beneath the earth in the center of the stone circle? Was it connected to the Matthews family? Was it connected to whatever had happened to them? The feeling of being watched grew stronger. A prickling sensation crawled up her spine as she turned around, scanning the surrounding trees, the shadows. She wasn't alone. She stepped back from the stone circle, tucking the key into her pocket as she carefully backed away, her senses on high alert. Something was here, something she hadn't seen yet, but she felt its presence, like a heavy weight in the air. Suddenly, a rustling sound broke the silence, followed by a soft, distant whisper that sounded like the wind. Except it wasn't the wind. The sound was too deliberate, too distinct. It was a voice, but it didn't come from anywhere she could see. It was coming from within the forest itself. Claire's flashlight flickered, the beam cutting erratically through the dense underbrush. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she had to leave. The weight in the air was unbearable now, and her mind screamed for her to run, to get out of this place. But as she turned to leave, she saw something that froze her in place. The clearing, the stone circle, it wasn't as empty as it had seemed moments before. The shadows in the trees had shifted, and now there was movement. Something, or someone, stepping out from behind the trees. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, its features obscured by the dim light. Claire couldn't make out any details, but she felt the overwhelming presence of something ancient, something that had been waiting for her, waiting for anyone who dared to trespass in this part of the forest. The voice echoed again, clearer this time, but still distant, as if it was coming from everywhere. "You should not have come here." Claire's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward, its silhouette moving with an unnatural grace. She felt her heart pounding in her chest, every instinct telling her to run, to escape. But her legs felt rooted to the spot, and before she could react, the figure was gone, vanishing back into the shadows of the trees. Her flashlight flickered once more, the beam now fading as her hands trembled. The cold, oppressive silence returned, the air thick with tension. Claire knew she couldn't stay here any longer. She turned and fled, her feet pounding against the uneven ground as she made her way back to the trail, the key still tucked tightly in her pocket. But the deeper she went, the more it became clear. She wasn't going to escape. The forest wasn't done with her. It had drawn her in, just like it had drawn in the Matthews family, and now it was watching her, waiting. When she reached the edge of the forest, gasping for breath, she dared to look back. The trees stood silent, their dark shapes looming over the clearing, and though she saw nothing, she knew. The forest had seen her, and it would never let her go. The truth was out there, buried deep in the shadows, but whether Claire was ready to uncover it, whether anyone could, remained to be seen. The Olympic forest was far from empty. It was alive, watching and waiting for the next person to come too close. Claire barely slept that night. The weight of what she had seen, the figure in the forest, and the unsettling, whispering voice gnawed at her, making every shadow in her hotel room seem to stretch and shift, like it had a life of its own. She clutched the rusted key in her hand, the metal cold against her palm, a constant reminder that there was something deeper to uncover, something she couldn't walk away from, no matter how much she wanted to. The next morning, she sat in the small cafe in Forks, her mind racing. She reviewed her notes, trying to make sense of the chaos of clues that had been unearthed over the past few weeks. The stone circle, the key, the symbol, and the strange presence in the forest. It all pointed to something ancient, something hidden beneath the layers of the park's history. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. It was a text from Richard Ellis, the friend of Brian Matthews she had met weeks ago. She opened the message and her stomach sank. "We need to talk. Come to the site. It's time you knew the rest. Richard had been hesitant to share much when they first met, but now it seemed he had finally decided to reveal what he knew. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. This was it, the moment when everything would either make sense or completely unravel. She immediately grabbed her things and headed out. The weather had turned overnight. Dark clouds hung heavy in the sky, casting an ominous shadow over the town. By the time Claire arrived at the edge of the forest, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of trees groaning and shifting. It was as though the very air had become charged, as if the land itself was waiting. Richard was waiting for her near the entrance to the park, looking more worn than when they had last met. His face was drawn, tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. There was something in his eyes, something that made Claire uneasy, a quiet desperation she hadn't seen before. "I don't know how to explain it," Richard said as she approached, his voice low. "But you're right. Brian wasn't just researching the land. He found something, and whatever it was, it didn't want him to find it." Claire took a deep breath. "What exactly are we talking about here? What did he find?" Richard hesitated, glancing around as if ensuring no one was watching. "It's a place, hidden in the forest, near Soda Springs. A place where the land bends, where time doesn't work the way it should, where people disappear and never return." Claire stared at him, trying to process his words. "What do you mean, where time doesn't work the way it should?" Richard rubbed his forehead, his eyes distant. Brian thought it was some kind of energy source. He thought the land was changing. Something was shifting beneath the earth, and it was affecting the forest around it. We know about the seismic activity and the strange magnetic fields, but what Brian found, it wasn't natural. It was something old, something buried, like the forest was hiding it. Claire's mind raced. Something buried? Like a structure? A ruin? Richard nodded. Maybe something more. He was convinced it was tied to the ancient peoples who lived here long before the settlers arrived, but he didn't have time to explain it all. After he started getting too close, after he saw something, he began writing in his journals about watchers in the woods. He said they were always there, always watching, and after that, he stopped writing. The air seemed to thicken around them as Richard spoke. Claire could feel the weight of his words settle on her shoulders, but she wasn't sure whether it was fear or curiosity that was making her head spin. "What do you mean, watchers?" Richard's gaze dropped to the ground. "That's what I've been trying to understand. Brian thought it was connected to the land itself, something alive, something ancient. He wasn't the first to notice it. There are stories, old stories, stories of things that used to roam the forest, things that didn't belong. The indigenous tribes that lived here before the settlers didn't talk about it much, but they had warnings. They told the settlers to avoid certain areas of the park, certain caves, but no one listened." Richard paused, and for a moment Claire saw the fear in his eyes, the fear that had been there since they first met. The Matthews family wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were drawn into it, just like Brian was. Claire's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, drawn into it?" Richard looked up at her, his expression grave. "Brian and the family were looking for something they weren't meant to find. The forest, the land, it's like a magnet. It pulls people in, it changes them. Brian was obsessed with uncovering the truth, and the deeper he went, the more he got pulled under." Claire felt a knot form in her stomach. This was more than just a missing persons case. It was something much darker, something far more insidious. The forest wasn't just a backdrop for an accident. It was the reason the family had disappeared. And now, Claire was standing at the edge of it, on the brink of discovering the truth, or losing herself to it, just as they had. Richard took a deep breath. "We need to go to the site. There's something I found that Brian was close to uncovering, something that's tied to the cave. It's not just a hiding place. It's part of something much bigger, and I think we're both being drawn into it now." They walked together into the forest, the trees looming over them like silent sentinels. With each step, the silence grew heavier, the weight of the forest pressing against their chests. The further they went, the more Claire could feel the pull, the sense that they were no longer just walking through the woods. They were walking into something else, something that didn't want them there. The deeper they ventured, the more Claire began to feel it, an overwhelming sense of dread, like the trees themselves were watching them, waiting for them to make the wrong move. And then, as they reached a secluded part of the forest, Richard stopped in his tracks. "This is it," he whispered. Before Claire could react, Richard pointed to the ground. Beneath their feet, the earth was disturbed, broken up like it had been recently excavated. Claire crouched down, brushing the dirt away, and found the edge of something hard, something metallic, old. Richard's voice was barely audible. "This is where it all ends." Claire didn't need to ask what he meant. They were standing at the mouth of the cave, the very place where the Matthews family had vanished. And as the darkness inside the cave loomed before her, Claire realized the terrifying truth. What they had been drawn to wasn't just a mystery. It was a force, one that had been waiting for them to find it, one that would never let them leave. The forest had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many others before them, and now Claire was about to learn exactly why. The air around them seemed to grow denser as Claire and Richard stepped closer to the cave's entrance. The forest, once a serene backdrop, had turned into something else, something suffocating, alive with a quiet, malevolent energy. Claire's heart thudded painfully in her chest, each step forward feeling like it took her deeper into the grasp of whatever force had drawn the Matthews family in, and now her too. Richard stood frozen for a moment, staring into the darkened mouth of the cave. This is where it begins. This is where Brian went, where the Matthews family... He trailed off, his words faltering under the weight of unspoken dread. Claire didn't speak. She simply nodded, her body betraying her resolve as her legs wavered. The air inside the cave was cooler, a strange, unnatural chill that seemed to seep through her clothes and settle in her bones. The darkness ahead felt thick, as though it stretched beyond the walls of the cave, beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. "Let's go," Claire said, trying to steady her voice, though it came out as little more than a breathless whisper. She wasn't sure if it was courage or sheer curiosity driving her forward, but she knew that if she stopped now, she would never get the answers she needed. There was no turning back. They stepped inside, their footsteps muffled by the thick, damp earth. The light from Claire's flashlight barely pierced the dark, revealing only jagged rocks and the occasional glint of water trickling down from the ceiling. The further they ventured, the more the air seemed to hum, as though something was vibrating just beneath the surface, waiting. The walls of the cave narrowed, forcing them to walk single file, the darkness closing in around them. As they moved deeper, Claire felt a shift in the air, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. Something had changed. The space felt alive. It wasn't just the sound of their footsteps or the echo of their voices that filled the cave. It was the silence that followed them, oppressive and unnatural, like the cave itself was holding its breath. And then, Claire saw it, the faintest flicker of light, shimmering in the distance. It wasn't the light from their flashlights. It was something else, something that seemed to pulse, like it was alive. The light was dim but growing brighter, glowing with an eerie, otherworldly hue. It wasn't natural. It wasn't fire. "What is that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling despite her attempts to remain composed. Richard's eyes widened in recognition, and for the first time, Claire saw real fear in his expression. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely audible, "but I think it's what Brian saw, what he found. Whatever it is, it's not something we're meant to understand." As they moved closer, the light became more distinct, its glow dancing along the cave walls. It illuminated an altar-like structure, formed of ancient stone, almost too perfect to be natural. The light came from within the altar, pulsing in slow, rhythmic waves. Claire stepped forward cautiously, her breath quickening as she studied the strange object. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. The markings on the stone, the patterns carved into its surface, mirrored the symbols she had found earlier, the ones etched into the trees, the ones connected to Brian's research. Richard took a step back, his face pale. This is what I was afraid of. This is what Brian was trying to warn us about. Claire approached the altar, her fingers hovering just inches from its surface. There was something magnetic about it, something that called to her. She could feel the energy in the cave shift as she moved closer, a presence building around her like a storm waiting to break. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the cave, rushing past them in a gust that felt unnatural. The light from the altar flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. And then, the ground beneath them trembled. "What the hell?" Richard gasped, stumbling backward. Before Claire could react, the sound of a low rumble filled the cave, rising in intensity. The earth beneath them shook, and the light from the altar flared wildly, blinding them for a moment. The walls of the cave seemed to close in, the space narrowing and contracting as though the very cave itself was alive, reacting to their presence. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. The rumbling ceased. The light from the altar faded back to its dim, rhythmic pulse. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire stood there, her body trembling, her heart racing. She looked around, but nothing had changed. The altar remained as it was, its strange markings glowing faintly in the dim light. But something was different. Something had shifted in the very air around them, and she could feel it, deep in her bones. Richard was staring at the altar, his face a mixture of awe and terror. "It's not just the forest," he whispered. "It's the land. It's this place, this cave. It's what's been pulling everyone in. It's been waiting for us." Claire turned to him, her eyes wide. "What do you mean? Waiting for us?" Richard's voice shook as he spoke. Brian wasn't just researching the forest, he was studying the cave. The energy here, it's like a force, like it's calling to people, drawing them in. It's been doing this for decades, for centuries. People come here, seeking answers, but what they don't realize is that the land itself has a hunger, and once you're drawn in, you can't escape. Claire's mind raced as the implications of Richard's words sank in. The Matthews family hadn't simply disappeared. They had been drawn here, pulled by something they didn't understand. Brian had been on the verge of discovering the truth, but had he gone too far? Had he become a victim of the very force he was trying to uncover? Claire looked at the altar again, her heart heavy with the weight of the realization. There was no turning back now. Whatever was in this cave, whatever ancient force had been hidden beneath the earth for so long, was not done yet. It had claimed Brian. It had claimed the Matthews family, and now it was calling her too. The air shifted again, and Claire felt the temperature drop sharply. The cave seemed to hum, vibrating with a subtle energy that reverberated through her chest. And in that moment, Claire knew the truth. She wasn't just a researcher anymore. She was part of this mystery now, whether she wanted to be or not. Before she could say another word, Richard grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the altar. "We have to leave," he said, his voice urgent. "It's too late for us. It's too late for anyone who comes here." Claire looked back at the altar one last time, the strange light flickering in the distance. She didn't want to believe it, but she knew he was right. The forest had claimed its next victims, and they were no longer just spectators. They were part of the forest now. As they hurried out of the cave, Claire heard the whispering again. It wasn't the wind, it was the forest, and it was waiting for the next person to come too close. The feeling of being chased didn't leave Claire as they made their way back through the winding trails, their hurried footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The forest seemed to press in around them, the trees reaching toward them like fingers, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. The unsettling quiet had returned, the kind that felt too heavy, as though the land itself was holding its breath, watching their every move. Richard kept his grip tight on Claire's arm, guiding her through the increasingly dense underbrush. His pace was quick, almost frantic, and Claire could feel his fear growing. She had always trusted her instincts, but now they were both operating on pure adrenaline, propelled by a growing sense of urgency that she couldn't shake. Every snap of a twig, every rustling in the trees made her heart jump. She couldn't explain it, but she felt as if the forest was alive, as if it was not content to let them leave. The cave, the altar, the pulsing light. It was all so wrong. It felt ancient, as though the forces that had been buried there had never really gone away. And now, she and Richard were caught in it, caught in the pull of the land's strange, unsettling power. "Richard, we need to talk about what we just saw," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper, but Richard didn't answer. He kept moving forward, his eyes darting nervously between the trees, scanning for any sign of movement. "Richard," Claire insisted, her voice shaking. "What's really going on here? What did Brian find? Why was he so obsessed with this place?" Richard's grip on her arm tightened. He stopped suddenly, his eyes locked on something in the distance. Claire followed his gaze and saw nothing but the forest stretching out ahead of them, an endless sea of trees and shadows. But Richard was staring at it, his face pale and drawn. "That's why I didn't want you to come here," Richard muttered, his voice barely audible. "I knew it would come for us too. I knew it would claim us just like the others." Claire turned to him, confused and desperate for answers. "What are you talking about? What is this thing? What is it that Brian found in that cave?" Richard exhaled sharply, his breath fogging in the cold air. Brian didn't just study the land. He got too close to whatever was buried in that cave. It's not just a place, it's something alive. The forest, the land, the cave, it's all connected. It's been waiting for people to stumble upon it, waiting for them to search for answers. And once it gets a hold of you, it doesn't let go. Claire's heart skipped a beat as Richard's words began to sink in. She'd felt it too, the oppressive presence, the sensation of being drawn into something far bigger than herself. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a living entity, a force that fed on those who dared to uncover its secrets. And the more Claire thought about it, the more she realized that the Matthews family hadn't been the first to fall victim to it. There had been others who had been swallowed up by the forest, their fates lost to time and fear. "Richard, are you saying that this is some kind of curse?" Claire asked, her voice trembling with the realization of how dangerous the situation had become. Richard nodded grimly. "Not a curse, a force, a presence. It doesn't care about us, about our lives. It just wants to remain hidden. The more people look for it, the stronger it gets. It feeds off the fear, the curiosity, the desire to uncover the truth. And once it has you, it doesn't let go." They began walking again, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was closing in on them, that the path back was no longer the way out. She glanced over her shoulder, but the trees behind them seemed unchanged, still, silent. Yet she could feel it, the oppressive presence, waiting just beyond the shadows. She had never believed in the supernatural, in things that went beyond the natural world, but now she was beginning to question everything she thought she knew. A rustling sound broke through the tension, causing both of them to freeze in place. The noise was coming from somewhere deep in the forest off to their left. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but then it grew louder. Claire strained to listen. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate. "Run!" Richard hissed, his voice filled with panic. "We have to get out of here. Now!" Without thinking, they both turned and sprinted through the trees, their breaths coming in sharp, panicked gasps. Claire's legs ached, but she didn't dare stop. The footsteps were growing closer now, each echo of movement sending a wave of terror coursing through her. It wasn't just an animal, not just someone following them. It was something else, something with purpose. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Claire caught a glimpse of something ahead. Another figure standing between the trees, watching them. It was tall, its outline flickering in the dim light. The shadows made it impossible to make out details, but Claire knew, deep down, that this was no person, no human being. "Go!" Richard screamed, his voice breaking. They pushed forward, their feet pounding the uneven ground, the figure now lost behind them in the trees. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded, that the forest was pushing them toward something, guiding them deeper into its heart. She glanced at Richard, and the terror in his eyes matched her own. Whatever was chasing them, it wasn't just after them. It was after the truth, and Claire had just scratched the surface. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the forest, their breaths ragged and uneven. They collapsed on the dirt path, the trees behind them now silent. But Claire knew, in the pit of her stomach, that the danger wasn't over. Richard, his face pale, slowly turned to her. "It's not over. The forest will never let us go." "Not now that we know." Claire swallowed hard, the weight of his words crashing down on her. "What do we do now?" Richard's eyes were filled with resignation. "We keep running. We don't stop looking. But you have to understand, we're not just looking for answers anymore. We're looking for a way out, and we may never find it." In that moment, Claire realized the terrible truth. The forest had already claimed them, and the only way out was to keep moving, to keep searching, even though the path forward would be one of constant fear. The forest had drawn them in, just as it had done to the others before them, and once it had you, it never let go. They weren't free, not yet, and maybe they never would be. The moment Claire and Richard reached the edge of the forest, the air felt different. It was thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness that made it hard to breathe. The distant hum of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the cries of birds, all of it had disappeared. There was only silence, and that silence was more terrifying than any noise could have been. They stood there, just beyond the tree line, the wild expanse of the Olympic forest stretching out behind them like a living thing, waiting, watching. Claire felt the weight of the past few days settle on her, everything she had uncovered, every clue she had followed, every step she had taken deeper into the unknown. The forest had been her pursuit, her obsession, and now it was a part of her. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that it had already marked her, that it was always going to pull her back. "We need to go to the authorities," Claire said quietly, trying to convince herself as much as Richard. Her voice was shaky, uncertainty creeping into her words. "We have to tell them everything, the cave, the altar, the symbols. We have to make them understand." Richard turned to her, his expression somber, his eyes dark with the weight of something deeper. "We can't go to the authorities, Claire. You know they'll never believe us. They'll sweep it under the rug like they've done with every other disappearance." Claire swallowed hard, the truth sinking in. She knew Richard was right. The National Park Service, the FBI, they would see it as nothing more than a series of unfortunate events. They wouldn't connect the dots. They wouldn't understand the significance of the strange symbols or the pulsing energy in the cave. They wouldn't understand the forest's hunger. "Then what do we do?" Claire asked, frustration bubbling beneath her calm exterior. "We can't just leave this. We can't just walk away and pretend nothing happened." Richard hesitated, looking over his shoulder at the looming darkness of the trees behind them. "We don't have a choice. The forest, it doesn't work like that. It won't let us go, Claire. The Matthews family, Brian, they all got too close. And now we have too. Whatever's out there, whatever it is, it's still watching us, It's waiting for us to come back." The words hit Claire like a cold slap. The truth was staring her in the face, and it was as terrifying as it was undeniable. There was no escape from this. The forest had already claimed its hold on them. Richard continued, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "Brian wasn't the first to get drawn in, and he won't be the last. I thought I could get away from it. I thought I could outrun it, but I've been wrong. The forest doesn't forget. It waits, and it gets what it wants." Claire's pulse quickened. "So what? We just leave? Leave the forest to take whoever it wants next?" Richard shook his head, his expression grim. "No, we fight. We go back to the cave. We figure out what Brian uncovered, what he was so obsessed with. But we do it on our terms. We won't let it pull us in like it did to him." The determination in Richard's voice gave Claire a sense of purpose, but the fear gnawing at her gut refused to subside. She knew that going back to the forest, back to the cave, would only deepen their entanglement with whatever lay hidden beneath the trees. But she also knew that Richard was right. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about survival. As they turned back toward the forest, Claire's thoughts raced. What would they find when they returned to the cave? What had Brian discovered in those final days, and what had driven him to keep going even when it seemed like the forest was closing in on him? And what was the thing that had been waiting for them, lurking in the shadows? The silence of the forest wrapped around them as they retraced their steps, the trees now looming overhead like silent sentinels, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes in the growing twilight. The further they walked, the heavier the air became, as if the forest was holding its breath. The trees seemed to close in around them, narrowing the path, forcing them forward. As they reached the clearing once again, Claire felt her heart pound in her chest. The cave was just ahead, its mouth dark and foreboding. The light from their flashlights flickered against the rock walls, casting long, ghostly shadows. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she pushed forward, knowing that the answers they sought were buried within that cave, and there was no way forward without facing it. When they reached the altar, the air inside the cave felt even colder than before. The strange light from the stone circle flickered again, casting a soft, eerie glow on the surrounding walls. The symbols etched into the stone were the same as the ones Brian had written about in his journals, the ones that had haunted Claire's every step. The key, now warm from being clenched tightly in her pocket, burned against her skin as if it were calling out to her. She pulled it out, holding it in her trembling hand. The moment her fingers wrapped around it, a low hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the cave, vibrating in her chest. The light from the altar flickered again, and the ground beneath them trembled. Richard's face went pale as the humming grew louder, almost deafening. "It's here," he said, his voice barely audible, filled with fear. "It's waking up. Whatever Brian found, whatever he uncovered, it's here." The ground beneath them trembled again, stronger this time. A distant rumble filled the cave, deep and guttural, as though the earth itself was groaning in response to their presence. The altar began to glow brighter, its energy pulsing in waves, almost as if it were alive, feeding off their fear. Claire's mind raced. She couldn't deny it anymore. Whatever this force was, it was older than anything she had ever encountered. It was connected to the land, to the very soul of the forest, and now it was awake, and it was coming for them. She gripped the key tightly, feeling the weight of its power surge through her. "We need to finish this," she whispered, her voice shaky. "We have to know what it wants. We have to stop it before it takes anyone else." Richard nodded, though his eyes were filled with fear. "I don't know if we can stop it, Claire, but we have to try." The cave's hum intensified, vibrating through the ground. The shadows around them seemed to writhe, the trees outside the cave groaning as if something was shifting, waking, growing. The forest was alive, and it had found its next victims. As Claire stepped forward, her breath shallow, she knew there was no going back. Whatever secrets lay buried in the cave, whatever force had been waiting for them, would either be destroyed or consume them whole. And in that moment, she realized one thing: the forest was never done with them. It was only just beginning. The air in the cave grew colder still, the humming from the altar reverberating through the stone walls, almost in sync with their heartbeats. It felt as if the very earth beneath their feet was alive, shifting and pulsing with an energy that Claire could no longer ignore. The light from the altar flared once more, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move with an intent of their own, like unseen figures lurking in the corners of the cave. Claire's hand shook as she clutched the key. It was no longer just a relic. It felt important. The moment her fingers closed around it, she could feel its presence, a connection she couldn't explain, like it had always been a part of her, waiting to be awakened. The cave seemed to respond, as if the key was a missing piece, a trigger that would set something into motion. Richard was beside her, his face pale and strained, his gaze locked on the altar. "This is it, Claire," he whispered, the words a grim warning. "Whatever happens next, we have no control over it. It's been waiting for so long. I don't know if we're meant to be here." But Claire couldn't turn back. The forest had already claimed them, drawing them deeper into its ancient grip. They had come too far. She had to know the truth, even if it meant risking everything. She took a step forward, moving closer to the altar, the light now blinding, as if it was drawing her in, pulling her to the very heart of the forest's mystery. The symbols etched into the stone pulsed with a rhythmic energy, their meaning beyond her comprehension. The air felt thick with something ancient, an energy older than the trees, older than the land itself. It was the heartbeat of the forest, the pulse of something that had lived and waited for millennia. The key in Claire's hand began to hum, resonating with the altar. It was as if the two objects were connected by an invisible thread, an energy force that Claire couldn't see but could feel vibrating through her body. The moment she placed the key into a small slot at the center of the altar, the ground beneath them shook. The rumbling was deep, unsettling, like the bones of the earth were cracking open. The walls of the cave began to tremble, and the ceiling groaned, as if something was stirring deep beneath the surface. The light from the altar grew brighter, more intense, until it was blinding. Claire shielded her eyes with her hand, but she couldn't pull away. The pull was too strong, as if the forest itself was calling to her, urging her to stay. Suddenly, a sharp, deafening crack split the air. The ground beneath them splintered. Claire felt herself falling, the world around her spinning, the light from the altar flashing, then fading. For a moment, she lost all sense of time and space. Then everything went black. When Claire regained consciousness, she was lying on the cold stone floor of the cave, the air thick and heavy. The hum had stopped, and the light from the altar had dimmed to a faint glow, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Richard was beside her, shaking her gently. "Claire, are you okay? Talk to me." Claire blinked, trying to gather her bearings. Her head ached, her body stiff, but she was alive. She slowly pushed herself up, her hands trembling. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Richard didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the altar, his expression unreadable. His eyes were wide with fear and confusion. Finally he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "It's gone." Claire turned to look at the altar, expecting to see the strange symbols, the pulsating light, but it was all gone. The altar was nothing more than a stone structure now, weathered and old, just as it had been before. The symbols were faded, indistinct. The air in the cave felt still, devoid of the heavy presence that had filled it moments ago. "It's gone," Richard repeated, his voice shaky. "The energy, the power, it was like it was alive. But now Now it's just stone. Claire's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had they unlocked something? Had they awakened something ancient, only for it to vanish when the key was placed in the altar? Or had it been a test, a challenge, a force meant to draw them in, to consume them? But now it was gone. She stood up slowly, her body still aching from the fall. The cave seemed quieter than it ever had before, the silence pressing in around her like a heavy fog. The stone circle, the symbols, the key, they were all part of something bigger. But what had they unleashed? And why did it suddenly feel as if they had been the ones being tested, as if the forest had been watching them all along? "Do you feel that?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. She turned to Richard, who was still staring at the altar, his face pale. Richard nodded, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It's like the forest is waiting. It's not done with us yet. We haven't found everything. There's still more." Claire stepped away from the altar, her mind racing. She had felt it too, the eerie stillness that now hung in the air. The forest wasn't finished with them. It had let them get this far, let them uncover some of its secrets, but now it was retreating, waiting for the next person to come, the next person to uncover its truth. But there was something else, something Claire hadn't expected. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the forest had been pushing them toward this moment, toward the altar, toward the key, toward unlocking the forest's dark secret. And it had known they would come. It had known they would uncover it. The force, the energy, whatever it wasn't gone. It had only been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As Claire and Richard turned to leave the cave, the ground trembled again, though this time it was faint. The trees outside the cave groaned in the wind, their branches creaking like old bones, and just before they stepped into the sunlight, Claire heard it. The faintest whisper carried on the breeze. "You've seen it. Now you can never leave." The forest had spoken, and it was only a matter of time before it would claim them both, just as it had claimed the others before them. And Claire understood, with a terrible clarity, that the forest would never let them go. Not now, not ever. The ground beneath Claire and Richard's feet seemed to pulse with an unnerving energy as they stepped into the open air, the forest stretching before them, vast and unknowable. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows across the forest floor, but the warmth of the day couldn't shake the chill that had settled deep within Claire's bones. They had come so close to uncovering the truth, and yet something told her that they had barely scratched the surface of the forest's dark secrets. Claire's breath was shallow, the weight of the warning still echoing in her mind. "You've seen it. Now you can never leave." The words had been soft, barely a whisper, but they had been as clear as the steady pulse of the earth itself. It was as if the forest had marked them, as if it knew that once they had glimpsed the truth, they would be forever tied to its mysteries. Richard walked beside her, his face as pale as hers. He had been in this place longer than she had, but now he, too, seemed haunted by the same realization. The forest had claimed them. It had drawn them in, just as it had with the Matthews family and countless others. They were no longer just investigators. They were part of the forest's twisted story, its secrets embedded in their bones. "We need to get out of here," Richard muttered, his voice strained. "We've seen too much. This place, it's not just a forest anymore. It's a prison, a place that traps you, that doesn't let you leave once you've found its heart." Claire nodded, but the thought of leaving didn't offer the relief she expected. She had uncovered enough to know that this wasn't just about the Matthews family. It wasn't about the cave, or the altar, or the symbols. It was about something far older, something woven into the very fabric of the forest. The forest had been waiting for them, drawing them closer with each step, each discovery. And now, it had them in its grasp. As they walked back toward the town, The silence of the forest around them felt suffocating. The trees loomed over them, their shadows stretching unnaturally long, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, following them. The further they moved, the more the forest seemed to retreat, as if it was giving them space, but in reality, Claire knew it was waiting for the next moment, the next chance to pull them back. They didn't speak much as they made their way through the forest, the oppressive weight of the place bearing down on them. The forest had been alive with something ancient and terrifying, something that had watched them from the moment they entered. It had been biding its time, drawing them deeper into its dark heart, and now that they had uncovered its secrets, it would never let them go. When they finally reached the edge of the park, the familiar world outside seemed distant and surreal, as though they had just emerged from another realm. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the landscape. Claire's heart was still racing, the memory of the cave and the altar still vivid in her mind. The forest had released them, for now, but it was never truly done. Not with them, not with anyone who ventured too deep. Richard stopped as they reached the parking lot, his face filled with a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. "We need to tell someone," he said, his voice quiet but urgent. "We need to make them listen. They need to know what's really out there." Claire looked at him, but the words died on her tongue. She knew what he meant. She had the same thoughts swirling in her mind. But the forest wasn't something that could be explained away. The authorities wouldn't believe them, not with the incomplete evidence, the strange discoveries, the cryptic messages. The forest would twist their story, make them out to be paranoid, delusional. They would never be able to convince anyone of what they had seen, not in the way it truly mattered. "I don't think they would believe us, Richard," Claire said quietly, her voice filled with the weight of the truth. "And even if they did, would it change anything? Would it stop the forest? Would it stop what's waiting for the next person?" Richard didn't answer. He just stared out at the fading horizon, as if searching for something in the distance. He too understood. The forest had a power far beyond their comprehension. It wasn't just a place. It was an entity, ancient and hungry, and it had been waiting for them. A strange sound broke the silence, a faint rustling in the trees behind them. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make Claire's heart stop. She turned quickly, scanning the line of trees at the edge of the park. The trees stood still, silent, but someone was out there, watching them from the shadows. Richard tensed beside her, his hand moving toward his pocket, where he had the small, rusted key Claire had found earlier. It felt heavier now, almost alive in her hand. She clutched it tighter, feeling the weight of it, as though it were a link to the very heart of the forest's power. Without another word, Claire and Richard turned and walked toward the car, but neither of them spoke as they drove back to Forks. The landscape outside the window seemed surreal, as though they were passing through a dream, a place that no longer felt real. The world outside the forest seemed distant, almost irrelevant now. The forest was a place where time didn't function like it should, a place that had claimed them, and would never let them forget what they had found. As they approached the town, the sound of distant thunder rumbled across the sky. The storm was coming, but it wasn't the storm Claire feared. The storm in the forest had already begun, and the forest was waiting for the next person to step too far into its heart. And Claire knew, as they drove through the fog and the haze of that ominous night, that no matter how far they ran, no matter how hard they tried to escape, they would never truly be free of the forest. The forest would always be with them, watching, waiting, because the forest was alive, and it had claimed them. The question remained, would they ever leave? The answer was still in the trees, still in the shadows, and Claire could feel it in her bones. They never would.